a model of negotiation, not TTIP itself, but a model of negotiation and agreement that is worth looking at. Make no stronger claim for it than that. It did, unlike other free trade agreements, seek to address the issue of services and regulation in a unique way, which is, of course, why it was so difficult to make progress in. But let's be honest, it was difficult because you had two giants with very clear systems, standards, norms entrenched. And to overcome that history in the end was too difficult, which is why I always felt that TTIP should be about the future rather than, certainly not about the past, and to a great extent not about the present either. The United States and the EU manage to develop the structures, habits of working, understanding and desire to see a convergence of its regulatory approaches to emerging sectors and markets within their respective economic areas, rather than try to sort of, disinter what's already been agreed and what's already firmly established. Now, all I'm saying is that there's a possibility of doing that in the case of the EU and the UK, but I fully accept when it comes to services and regulation, we're in reasonably sort of untried, untested territory, and for the EU, they would have to ask themselves whether it's really worth the candle. It was sort of worth it in the prize of a market the size of the United States to try. It would be up to the EU 27 to decide whether the size of the UK market makes it worthwhile. I would simply underline that we are a fairly big economy in Britain. We are in close proximity. We're the biggest on the EU's doorstep. It therefore is not irrational for the EU in the course of the normal development of its trade policies to see how it might address such a third country as Britain.
Thank you, Peter. Jean-Claude.
Obviously, it would be in the interest of the UK. UK is one of the best countries in the world for financial services. And it has a balance which is largely positive with the 27 on financial services, while the balance on goods and products is exactly the reverse. The EU, the 27 are positive. First of all, I will notice that inside the EU, we are late in making the internal market on services. Why? Because there are oppositions inside the EU, including from Germany. So I don't think they will accept easily also for their own interests to go this way. And don't forget that for the EU, there is a sacrosanct principle, which is both legal and political. Internal market is 4 freedoms. 4 freedoms. So the movement of persons is even more important than the free movement of services, especially for the European Parliament, who has a right of veto on the final agreement. So don't have illusions. As Michel said a while ago, I don't think this is the way which is
existential threat to Ireland. So how far would you encourage Dublin to go with this? From an Irish perspective, is no deal in an excellent publication called E-Sharp magazine about how the Norway option, about the enormous illegal impediments to a Norway deal and how it's legally very difficult to put in place. Have you changed your opinion? Could get to a Norway-type deal?
Anyone who knows my political history will know that any difference that might exist between Northern Ireland as long as it remains part of the United Kingdom and the rest of the United Kingdom. That's why I have to say I found the reference to the Irish government working in cahoots with Sinn Féin to be quite shocking. Quite shocking. My party, and my party is currently in government, would hold that that's such a bizarre suggestion. However, I think we've got to work to resolve this problem. The solution I would prefer is for Britain to stay in the customs union and the single market, which is consistent with the referendum decision that was taken. That's the solution. The idea that somehow or other we in the Republic of Ireland have territorial ambitions vis-à-vis Northern Ireland. There is a desire for a united Ireland if that's possible and if that's what both communities in Northern Ireland decide that they want. But while I wouldn't go fully the road with Peter Mandelson saying economics trumps identity politics, the economics of a united Ireland are not brilliant from our point of view. Public expenditure per head is 30% of the GDP of Northern Ireland is represented by transfers from London. If Dublin had to replace those transfers, you can only speculate what that would cost us if Northern Ireland were to leave the UK. It would be a very expensive proposition. Likewise, the British decision to leave the customs union and the single market is going to impose immense costs, not just on our businesses, but on our state. We will have to probably double the Garda presence along the border. We will have to re-establish an entire customs regime, entirely unproductive public employment, all of which will have to be paid for by a good part. This is something which is imposed upon us by a decision in which we had no part at all. So I do appeal to you not to make the mistake of thinking that this has anything to do with territorial ambitions on the part of Dublin. This is all about trying to minimise the effect on us as a third party of decisions in which we had no part. And I think it is an attempt to bring decision makers in London face to face with what they are deciding, because it seems to me that decision makers in London at the moment aren't capable of seeing beyond internal party politics. They're so consumed with the party politics of the issue and keeping Corbyn out or whatever it is, that they haven't even space left in their brain to consider any other issues. So that's why I'm not going to answer Simon's question.
Okay, Jean-Claude, you were asked a question.
Why not the UK in EEA, in the Norway model? Well, first it has to happen after Brexit, so that we will need a period of transition. Second, the EU, there will be a procedure by which the UK will have to negotiate its membership of EFTA first with Switzerland and the three Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. Secondly, membership of EEA with 31 ratifications, including the EU. And we will have to change the texts. And the EU does not seem enthusiastic. Why I say that? Because they had some problems in the past with backlog and so on and so forth, but it proves it, because nowadays the EU is negotiating some kind of association agreements with 4 countries. A big one, in trade, Switzerland, and it does not propose EEA to Switzerland. It proposes something which is much tougher than the EU, than the EEA. And it negotiates with 3 tiny, small countries also, same thing. Does not propose EEA, propose things which are tougher. For example, the EU Court of Justice as it is, and not the EFTA court, which has to. But the most important thing is that the UK will never accept to go in EEA because on internal market without having decision making, because it has to accept the four freedom on freedom of persons, because it has to accept the Court of Justice of EFTA, which by the mixing of two articles on the, I pass on the details, and a protocol of EFTA means that if you have courts of the EU and the courts of EFTA on internal market law, the EU court wins. So, and it will have to pay to the budget as well. So I think it's too much for the pride of the UK, and I think they will never accept that.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Peter, briefly.
2 points. First of all, in reference to my own party, the Labour Party, I think the job of the opposition, official opposition in Britain, is to oppose a hard Brexit, the single market and the customs union, and secondly, its job is to oppose the Brexiteers' real agenda, which is to deregulate and erode social, environmental and consumer standards and protections in Britain. I think that has always been at the heart of their design, starting 20 years ago. They are the inheritors, the true inheritors of Thatcherism, and want to see it unfold. Is to oppose that, and it should do so by trying to see an opportunity to create a pause in Brexit so that this proper debate can take place, not in order to defy the will of the people, but to enable the British people to take rather more informed and rational decisions about this than they were given the information with which to do so at the time of the referendum. Final postscript on Northern Ireland. I think that, John, if I may, you're being a tad unfair to Charles Grant. Charles did not actually say that the Irish government were in cahoots with Sinn Féin. I think I'm right in saying that he said that the British public, or elements in the British public, would think, or perceive that the Irish government was in cahoots with Sinn Féin. And while we're in the business of correcting the record, let me correct something, or make clear something I said. When I talk about the Republican movement, I think that Sinn Féin, the political wing, would receive a political boost from the reinsertion of a border into Ireland. I think that other elements of the Republican movement, dissidents, would take advantage of that potentially and move back to violence. I just make that distinction.
Okay, I still have Graham and Michael on my list. Anybody else want to ask a question before I close the list? Yeah, I can't even see you. Okay, Peter. Okay, fine. Right.
Thanks, Paul. At the risk of asking a question from left field, there appears to have been most of the discussion on the border focusing on Ireland. But there is, of course, another border across which 13,000 people move every day. Half of them are Spanish. The European Union. It is almost impossible for Gibraltar to get a hearing in Brussels because of the cowardice of officials in the face of obstreperousness from a country which appears to have a problem with democracy. My question really to Jean-Claude Piris and John Bruton would be, what would your advice be to get some discussion of the Gibraltar border on the Brussels agenda?
Thank you, Graham. Could you please both be extremely brief? Jean-Claude and John.
Well, I don't think really Gibraltar will be a big problem. I think it will be settled by the British and the Spanish.
John, thank you.
I think that's right. Obviously, Gibraltar must do its diplomatic work here in Brussels, too.
Wonderful brevity. Michael Swan at the back.
Thanks very much, Michael Swan. Question about how to square the Brexit circle. At the national level, there's long been a recognition that islands are different. Corsica has a particular treatment within the French Republic. The Canary Islands have a particular treatment within the Spanish Kingdom. At a European level, and I'd maybe ask Monique Ebell, because we have not heard a woman's voice so much today, whether there could be any mileage in some recognition that islands are different at the European level. Thank you.
There you go, Monique. You want to question that?
No, not at all. Look, I'm an economist. I am not as well versed in the politics, and certainly not of those of Northern Ireland and Ireland, so I think I'm really going to pass on that question.
Sorry, maybe over sandwich lunch, Michael, okay? Final question for Peter Klepper, and I may ask, since the last question, if anybody in the panel wants to answer briefly or say any final remarks in answer. Okay, Peter.
Peter Klepper from Open Europe. Thank you to Mr. Piris for explaining why it's indeed, I think, science fiction that the UK would somehow remain in the EEA and copy-paste all the rules from the EU without being able to vote on it. And I think that's exactly the case for the customs union issue, because if you think it's true, if Britain would remain in a common customs union with the EU, just like Turkey, it would mean that the British would not be at the table when the EU is negotiating with Australia, and that Australia would get automatic access to the UK, while Britain would have to ask Australia if it could get the same access in reciprocity. So I think it should be obvious to anyone that this is a no-go, and I think if you're trying to softening Brexit, which is actually also something that Open Europe is trying to do, I think you should, I think it's just a bit science fiction to expect that Britain will remain in the customs union and the EEA, of course, after the transition, which may well longer take than we all suspect.
Thank you, Peter. Final comments, 30 seconds each from each of the panel, if they want to. Jean-Claude first.
Well, I agree. I think there are two solutions to square the circle. One solution, which is my preferred, is that after political chaos continuing in the UK, and maybe you have new elections, maybe you have a new referendum, and the letter of withdrawal is withdrawn, and UK remains in the EU. And I think it is legally possible, and some say we have to have agreement of the 27 others. I think we might even have that. I don't think it's legally necessary, but majority of in the EU thinks it's necessary, but I think we might have that. The second, but I give between 5 and 10% of chances to that, maximum. The second thing is that the UK government is sensible and explains to its population and prepares its population to that we are going to be to an FTA like Canada. Not only like Canada, because we'll have a transition period of 2 or 3 years, because we'll have a lot of other agreements on external security, internal security, access, I hope, to agencies, despite the fact that Michel was a little bit unclear about that, Euratom, and so on and so forth. I think the UK government should speak clearly the truth to its people.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Peter.
Just in response to what Peter said from Open Europe, I'm not quite sure what your right is to impose your interpretation of the. I know that the Brexit press, and I know the hardliners in the Tory party interpret it as meaning that Britain shouldn't stay in the single market or the customs union, but equally, and with great similar validity, I think I could say to you that the British people did not vote last year to make themselves poorer, which is what the consequence of the course of action you're advocating would be. And secondly, there are many people in Britain, myself included, who do not like to see Britain, given our size and status, as a rule taker. But I have to say to you, I think it would be better to be a rule taker on the periphery of Europe and for our environmental, social, labour market, consumer standards and rules to be maintained, rather than to see those swept away by a bunch of hard-nosed Brexiteers.
Peter. Monique?
Sure. I think I would agree with a lot of what Peter just said, in the sense that even though it's less than ideal that we stay in without a voice, it is much better than the alternative. That does mean accepting free movement of labour. That is something that I think it's actually irresponsible of UK parties not to be preparing the electorate for. And I agree also, I think it's a very important point that the agenda of some of the hard Brexiteers is a libertarian extremist agenda that wants a race to the bottom in terms of labour standards and environmental standards. And I think we need to be very careful not to let that happen.
Thank you, Monique. Final word, John.
Just make two suggestions. Firstly, I think the UK government has said that it wants a bespoke agreement with the European Union. I think it should actually write up a draft of that agreement itself, taking into account the interlaken principles, which Britain had a hand in drafting, which govern EU relations with third parties. If the EU actually drafted up, if the UK actually drafted up a paper, I think that would be an educational exercise within the UK. Secondly, given, this may sound completely unrealistic, but we're heading for a train crash at the moment. We're heading for a very serious train crash. 2 years, and I have to share responsibility with one other party here for that Article 50. I was in the convention, in the Presidium. 2 years is far too short for this consideration to be, for Britain to become comfortable fully with Brexit and what it means, and for the rest of Europe to become comfortable fully with Brexit and what it means, and for all the creative possibilities to be explored. I think we should have a 6-year period in Article 50, which can be agreed by unanimity. Under that arrangement, Britain would still be in the European Union for the full duration of the 6 years. No need for a transition. And in that 6-year period, Britain, being understood, Britain would leave at the end of the 6 years. All of these issues that are now being considered in an emotional atmosphere where people feel they're being ignored and so forth, could be considered in a less emotional atmosphere. But that requires both Britain and the EU to take a step back. Britain needs to take a step back on this urgency of getting out in case we might change our mind, because they're afraid they might change their mind. And it requires the EU to admit that it made a mistake, we made a mistake in putting in 2 years, and we should allow a longer period, at least in this case, so that take some pressure out of the whole issue and allow people to actually consider the grave seriousness of the issues which are in contemplation.
Thank you, John. We now break for lunch. Before we do so, could you please give a round of applause for our tremendous panel. And back here at 2:15. Thank you.